Good morning. My name is Greg Sutherland. I'm with the Word of Faith Fellowship, and I am so glad to be here with you today just to share with you what Jesus has been speaking to me, because life comes to me when I hear the voice of God, and life comes to you when you hear the voice of God. Paul talked about, the message that comes from the lips of Jesus. That's what gets us through anything and everything, because Jesus has a hold of it all. A lot of times we think as human beings that God really doesn't care. He's got a universe to run. He's got all the millions, billions of people to watch out for. He doesn't really care about the details of my life, how my hair is fixed, what I'm going to wear, what I'm going to eat. But truthfully, he does. God really does care about me, and he cares about you. And that's what I want you to understand today. If you let that go into your heart today, you can walk through anything with Jesus. It says in Job 36:5 that even though God's mighty, he made this whole world that we live in, all the trees, the plants, every person that's ever lived on the face of this earth, and yet nothing is considered trivial by him. The Bible says that he knows every hair on our head, and we don't even know that much, but God cares about every detail of our life. So how can we stay in that place of being right with God? I want to be right with God. He has a hold of the details of my life. I want to know that I'm not cutting him off in what I do or say. Because many times, even in our human lives, when we do something that somebody didn't want us to do, it breaks that fellowship with them until we make it right. And I don't want any broken fellowship with God. I want to know that I'm right with him. And Paul in Romans was talking about the Jews, how they had a zeal for God, but they didn't know how to do things to stay right with God. They thought they knew. They thought if I kept the law and I do this and I don't do that, that they were going to be right with God, because that's what God said. And God did give them the law, but that was just a guideline to hold them, to hold us until Jesus came, and Jesus comes into our life. But Paul said in Romans chapter 10, verse 3, he said, "For being ignorant of the righteousness that God ascribes, which makes one acceptable to him in word, thought, and deed." Now, that means that it's what does God require? What is God wanting? He wants that personal, intimate, one-on-one relationship with you and with me, so that he can tell us, do this, don't do that, go this way, don't go that way, walk here. It says in Isaiah 30 that when we have that kind of relationship with God, that we'll hear a voice behind us saying, "This is the way, walk in it," when you turn to the right hand or you turn to the left. I want to hear that voice. We hear every day of tragedies, of car accidents, lightning strikes, terrible storms, earthquakes, tsunamis, all kinds of things where people lose their lives. But I truly believe that if I hear that voice behind me, at every point, God won't lead me into those things, and God will protect me. And I want that relationship with him more than anything else. But it goes on to say that even though they were ignorant of the righteousness that God ascribes, it says they were seeking to establish a righteousness, a means of salvation of their own. They tried to find their way through to God through their own works, what they could do. It says because of that, they did not obey or submit themselves to God's righteousness. So they totally missed the plan of God for their life. I don't want that. Many years growing up, I thought I was right. I was in church all the time. Every time the doors were open, I was in church. But I did not have that relationship with God to where I did his will. I thought I did, but it was really a relationship with what I had been told or with what was said here, rather than God speaking it to me. When I was young, I remember my parents said, "Okay, you're going to read your Bible tonight." And I would read it. And I wouldn't get anything out of it because it wasn't out of that relationship with God. But when I personally, me, not my parents, but me, began to turn my heart to God and say, "God, speak to me," then every verse I read, God spoke to me through that. This Bible is thousands of years old. But when God speaks it to you, it's alive, it's real, it's pertinent to you today and in every situation you go through. I am just constantly in amazement. God will speak verses to me, and I'll lay it to my heart, and I'll say, okay, Jesus, what are you trying to say to me? And sure enough, at some point during my day, something will happen. Somebody will say something. I'll have something go on, and I'll realize that's why God gave me that verse. Because God loves me. And I'm no different than you. God loves you, and He will speak to you because He loves you. But you have to do things His way. You have to have that relationship with Him, which is what He wants. And He's put a desire on the inside of each one of us to have that relationship with Him. So all we have to do is take those steps that God tells us, and it builds that relationship. The more I am with someone, and the more I'm walking with them, the more I get to know them, and the more I get to know they're going to go this way, or they walk this way. They walk this fast, not that fast. You know, it's personal. God's a personal God. But I don't want to not obey or submit myself to God's righteousness. Because Jesus said in Matthew 7, He said, on the day of judgment, there's going to be a lot of people that stand before God. And they're going to say, Lord, Lord, I did all these things in your name. I prayed in your name. I went to church. I did this. I was a good person. I didn't do all these bad things. I kept the 10 Commandments. And God's going to say to them, but I never knew you. Depart from me, you who act wickedly, disregarding my commands. I don't want that said about me, and I don't want that said about you. That's not God's will for my life or your life. God has a good plan for us. So where are those places in our lives where we cut off that relationship? We break that relationship with God. And that's where God's been speaking to me. It's not in the big things you might think, but it's in the little things that we may consider trivial, that we may not pay attention to, that God's trying to warn us and God's trying to help us and say, do it this way. You know, there's probably 5 or 6 ways that I have that I could get to work every day. But I try to, when I get in the car each morning, I'm asking Jesus, which way do you want me to go? Because I know God knows what's best for me. He knows what's literally down the road. And He understands the best way for me. But more importantly than that, that's developing a relationship with Him for me to ask Him and for me to wait and listen to His voice and obey. That's what it's all about right there. So God gave me some examples that I wanted to share with you out of the Bible. You know, when Jesus was walking here on this earth, He had 3 friends. He had a man named Lazarus, and who had a sister named Martha and a sister named Mary. And in Luke chapter 10, Jesus was in His travels, and He was going around with His disciples, and it says in Luke 10:38, now while they were on their way, it occurred that Jesus entered a certain village, and a woman named Martha received and welcomed Him into her house. And she had a sister named Mary. And this is what Mary did. Mary seated herself at the Lord's feet and was listening to His teaching. And that says something to me right there about Mary. She wanted to hear the voice of God. She welcomed Him into her home. It was her home with her sister Martha and her brother Lazarus. And it says she seated herself at the Lord's feet. Now, you know, we may not be able to physically sit down in front of Jesus' feet here in the flesh. But when I stop and ask Jesus, how do I get to work today? That's sitting myself at the feet of Jesus, because what that means is I want to hear His voice. I want to hear what Jesus has to say to me today. And in verse 40 it says, but Martha, overly occupied and too busy, was distracted with much serving. Now, stop there for a minute and think through your life. You know, that right there is where we miss God every day. We get overly occupied and too busy. And that's where God's really been speaking to me personally over the last several weeks, to stop what I'm doing and don't run off and forget Jesus. Don't run off and leave Him, because He really does know and really does care about everything that I'm doing. Whether I'm at work, whether I'm at home, whether it's what I eat, what I wear, how I do my job, God knows best. But I've watched in myself even, and God said, it's like you're standing in front of a freight train trying to hold it back, trying to hold back the tide of the ocean, and it's just pushing you forward, and you can't stop it. That's what happens when you get overly occupied and too busy. And God's had me stop, make sure I'm asking Jesus. And sometimes I don't do that, and I'll get down the road and I'll realize I'm concerned, I'm worried, I'm working, I'm trying to get this done because it's got to get done. But I left Jesus. And now I'm trying to do it in my own ability, not in his ability. And there's no grace of God there to do what he's asked me to do. Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians, he said he was given a special endowment for his task. And that verse has stuck with me over the last couple of weeks. I pray often, Jesus, you said you gave me a special endowment for my task, whether it's doing my job, sitting here with you this morning, doing what I do at home, whatever it is. If I will walk with Jesus, have a relationship with him, his grace, his divine influence, his divine assistance in my life will cause me to do it. And when you do things with God's ability and in God's grace, what seems so hard is so simple. Think about the disciples and the account where they were trying to cross the lake. And it says a huge storm, a storm of hurricane proportions, came up. And they're rowing, trying to get to the other side because Jesus said, go to the other side. So they had heard the voice of God, go to the other side. But somewhere they left the grace of God, and they're rowing, trying to get there. And the more they row, the worse it gets. The water's pouring into the boat. They're about to sink. And finally, the disciples go and wake Jesus up, who's not worried at all. He knows what's coming. He knows what God's going to do. And he's not worried 1 ounce. And they wake him up and say, are you not concerned that we're about to die? And before we throw stones at the disciples, let's stop and think, how many times do we do that? We may not be in a boat rowing in a storm, but storms come up in our life. And it seems like hurricane proportions at times. It's so overwhelming. It's so hard to deal with. But we've cut God off. We didn't run to him. All we have to do is turn and run to him. He will be right there to help us. It says that Jesus, in the days of his flesh, he cried out for that which he not only wanted but needed. So if Jesus did that, how much more do we need to do that? But it says in Hebrews that he will run to our assistance. He will run to our aid when we cry out to him. All we have to do is turn our hearts to him. It's just easy. And you may think, well, yeah, it's easy for you, but truly it is easy. I've watched the more I turn my heart to God, the more he's there to answer me. And not just way down the road. He answers right away. But I've been developing a relationship with him. And that's where I want to encourage you today. Develop that relationship with God. Letting him speak to you, letting him help you in the little things that you do, no matter what it is. It's developing that relationship. And the more you do that, when it comes to the big things of hurricane proportions, it won't be so huge. It'll be peaceful. God will speak to you. You'll hear his voice behind you saying, go this way. And you do it, and it just all falls into place because God is with you. That's what we all want. So listen to what Jesus said to Martha. It says, Martha came up to Jesus and said, Lord, is it nothing to you that my sister has left me to serve alone? You can hear the frustration in her voice because she's cut off the grace of God. But how many times do we do that? God, how could you let this happen? Or we'll even say that to people around us. What's going on with you? Why could you do this to me? But truthfully, where's the grace of God in our hearts that brings that peace? It says in Colossians 3 that we should do everything that we do in the name of the Lord in divine dependence upon him. That's the only way we have peace. That's where peace comes. when you know that God's right there with you, helping you. You know, as children, when we were growing up, when we had adults in our life and they came and helped us, it brought peace because we knew they could do it and I couldn't. It's no different now. It's no different no matter how old we are, whether you're 99 or 9 months, it doesn't matter. God's still there. God still wants to help us in every single thing. And Martha said, tell her then to help me, to lend a hand and do her part along with me. Now listen to Jesus' response. But the Lord replied to her by saying, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things. And truthfully, I could put my name in there. And Greg, you are anxious and troubled about many things. And a lot of times he'll say something like that to me, and I'll have to settle down and say, God, you're right. Forgive me. I went off and left you. I don't want to do that. And I settle back down. I get my relationship with God restored. And then I could go forward doing things in the grace of God, letting him help me. And Jesus finished up by saying, there's a need of only one or but a few things. But Mary has chosen the good portion, that which is to her advantage, which shall not be taken away from her. And you know, really, when you settle down and you let God help you with your task, the peace that comes, but not only that, it develops that relationship with God, and it's something that stays with you. It's a landmark. It's a memorial, God calls it in the Bible. It's an anchor so that the next time you can move forward. If you've ever watched rock climbers, when they're climbing up rock faces, they'll take a stake and they'll drive it into that rock, and their rope is attached to that stake. And they'll climb up a little farther, and they'll drive another stake in. And those stakes are there so that they slip or they fall, they're not going to fall past that last stake they drove in. It's going to hold them till they can get back to that stake and move on again. Well, that's what those anchors are in our life. Those places where we stop and we say, God, please help me. I just want to do your will. And God's divine assistance comes, his grace, and he helps us do whatever it is. That's an anchor of our soul. That's a stake driven into that rock so that if we fall, we don't fall past that point. We can always go back to that and say, but God, you helped me the last time. Devil, God did help me, and he will help me again. It's those places that hold us so that when we fall, we don't fall all the way away from God to where there's no return. Many people, that's what happens to them. They'll go so far with God, and Jesus talked about that in Mark 4. You know, all these things happen. Things happen in our lives, and we're human. We have that sin nature we're still fighting against. But if you don't do it in God's grace and with his assistance, then you fall. But if you don't have those anchors, you're going to fall a long way. And that's where Jesus was talking about in Mark 4, when he was talking about the sower, the farmer, the sower of the seed, and he was giving them a parable, an illustration, and he said, this illustration means the sower sowing the word that comes from God. And in verse 15, Mark 4:15, those words that are sown along the path are those that have the word sown in their hearts. But when they hear, it says Satan comes at once and by force takes away the message which is sown in them. And we have that happen a lot. You know, we'll hear the voice of God. God will speak to us, and we start to take those steps. And sure enough, Satan comes right away with something. He'll come through somebody or through some circumstance to steal what God just spoke to us. And if we don't grab hold of those anchors in our life, it does get stolen and we fall. And verse 16 says, in the same way, the ones sown upon stony ground are those who, when they hear the word, at once receive and welcome it with joy, but they have no real root in themselves. And so they endure for a little while. Then when trouble and persecution arise on account of the word, because of what God spoke to them, they immediately are offended, become displeased, indignant, and resentful, and stumble and fall away. I don't want that to happen to me. I don't want to just hear something that God says and be excited about it and be happy about it and then something comes up to test me and I lose that. I want what God says to me to go into my heart, and the Bible talks about I want it engraved, like writing with a steel into stone. I want it engraved in my heart so that it never leaves. Those are anchors. Those are places in your life you can always go back to, grab hold of when the storm gets huge and the wind's blowing and the trees are waving and the rain's beating down. You can grab hold of those anchors, those places that God spoke to your heart, and stand in the midst of the storm and walk with God through it. David in Psalms 23 said, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. So he had obviously been walking through some hard places, through some hurricanes in his life. He said, even though I walk through the valley of that shadow of death, I will fear no evil because you're with me. That's what I want. That's what I know you want. And God wants us to walk there today. And then in verse 19, then it says, the ones that are sown among thorns are others who hear the word. Then the cares and anxieties of the world. And we all experience those every day. Worried about, are we going to have a job? Worried about finding a job. Worried about keeping our jobs. Worried about, is Walmart going to have the food that I need? Whatever it is, we have those cares and anxieties of the world and distractions of the age. Every single person on this world experiences that. And the pleasure and delight and false glamour and the deceitfulness of riches and the craving and passionate desire for other things, they creep in, it says, and choke and suffocate the word, and it becomes fruitless. And this is really the verse that God spoke to me, because there's a lot of things that happens in our lives that come in and they choke it out. We get caught up in doing a task, caught up in, I've got to get this done. There's pressure on. There's a time limit. There's somebody waiting, whatever it is. The pressure's on to get this done. And what do? Do we let those things creep in and choke out and suffocate the word, the grace of God that's there to help me do what I need to do? Do we let those things happen? And that's where God's been stopping me and saying, you're letting that choke out what I said to you. And I'll stop and I'll take a step back. Okay, Jesus, forgive me. How do I do this? How do you want to do this? And again, like I said earlier, the peace comes and I can walk through it. But if you keep going on in that anxiety and that worry, even our bodies react to that. We get ulcers, we get headaches, we get sore throats, we get a lot of physical symptoms in our bodies reacting to where we've cut off the grace of God. And our bodies are even saying, stop, settle down. Sometimes I'll say to people, when they're getting worked up in a frenzy, I'll say, settle down. It's going to be okay. Jesus is going to see us through this. And they settle down, I settle down. We can have the voice of God together, and that's what we want. But Jesus said, and this is what I want, and those sown on good, well-adapted soil, that soil that's well-adapted means you're walking in a relationship with God. So those are the ones that hear the word, they receive it, they welcome it, they accept it, and they bear fruit. We see the results in our lives because God's assistance is there for us. It says sometimes 30 times as much as was sown, sometimes 60 times as much, and even 100 times as much. I want the 100 times as much. A lot of times it's just the 30 and 60, but it's good fruit. And that's what I want. We want good fruit in our lives. That brings peace. That brings happiness. It brings joy in our lives. That's what God has for us. So let's settle down today. Stop yourself and say, settle down. It's going to be okay. God has a hold of me. I'm going to submit myself to Him and let Him help me. God took me back through many examples in the Bible. You think about Jairus, who came to Jesus because his daughter, his only daughter, was dying. Now you talk about cares and anxieties. It was weighing on him. It was like a weight of stone on him because his only daughter's dying. And Jesus went with him to go heal his daughter. But in the midst of it, the crowds are all around Jesus. It says they were almost suffocating him They were so close. And there was a woman in the crowd. She fought her way through that crowd. And she had a physical condition that she'd had for 12 years. Said she had gone to physicians, spent all her money, but was no better. But she knew when she heard about Jesus, she kept telling herself, if I can just get to him, even if I could just touch the hem of his garment, I know I'll be healed. And it wasn't the hem of Jesus' garment. It was she was going to Jesus. In her heart had turned to Jesus for help. And she fought her way through that crowd, and she was just able to reach and grab the edge of his garment. And when she did, she was instantly healed. Not 6 months later, instantly. But it says that Jesus, in the midst of, he's carrying, this daughter is dying. He's trying to keep hold of the Father. The crowd around him suffocating him, wanting this, wanting that, trying to talk to him. But he feels the healing power of God leave him. And he stopped the whole crowd. He stopped everything. Now, Jairus' daughter's still sick. And he said, who touched me? And the disciples said, what do you mean, who touched you? Look at all these people. Jesus said, somebody touched me. And that woman realized what he was saying, and it was her. And she came forward. She was afraid of what was going to happen. But she came and fell at Jesus' feet and told him everything. And he said, woman, your faith has made you whole. It wasn't his clothing. It was her faith in God to come to Jesus that made her whole. And it's our faith in God, when we make that decision, that choice to come to Jesus, that's what brings God's assistance on the scene. That's what gets us through it. That's what gets the job done. Not my ability, but God. And that's what sees us through things. And that faith builds more faith. And it builds more faith. And it builds hope. And it builds joy. We want that. But don't forget about Jairus. They came at that point and they told him, don't bother him anymore. Your daughter's dead. But Jesus grabbed a hold of Jairus, and it says, overhearing it but ignoring it, he said, just believe in me. And you know the rest of the story. Jesus went to the house. The daughter was dead. He went in there, drove out the people that were laughing at him when he said that she's just sleeping. And he went in there, and the power of God came through him to raise that little girl from the dead. And he restored her to her parents. And he wants to restore us. He wants to bring life to us today. Today, and whatever we're doing, whatever you're doing today, God has life. He has joy. He has peace. He has divine assistance for us. Grace to walk through whatever we have today. You know, we all know that hymn, Amazing Grace. It is truly amazing. The ability of God that will flow through us to develop that relationship with him. So I encourage you today, just turn to him today. Just pour your heart out to him with what you're doing today and let him help you. And he will. He will. So I'm so grateful you were here today. Whether you're listening on the radio or listening on the internet, we're glad you're here. You know, you can join us on WCAB every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 8:30 to 9. Or you can go to our website at wordoffaithfellowship.org and see all of our radio programs. They've been archived there for you. And they'll bring encouragement to you. They'll bring hope. And when you hit those hurricane storms in your life, if you need to, pull one of those up, watch it, because God will speak to you. His voice will come to you to see you through whatever storm is in your life. We love you and have a great day.